In this lesson, I'll introduce the concept of close reading and give an example of how to close read a text. A close reading is a precise, in-depth interpretation of a text. When you close read, you are reading slowly and attentively, ideally holding a pencil, annotating the text, underlining or highlighting key words and phrases, as well as making notes in the margins. Close reading means thinking about the text analytically, moving from smaller to larger observations about it, and eventually drawing an interpretive conclusion about its meaning. In a close reading essay, the goal is to draw conclusions about a text and use small details from the text as evidence. Most commonly, we close read short texts or short passages of a longer text. In your first essay, for example, you will be close reading a section of a text of about 200 words. There are two steps to close reading. In the first step, you take your time to read the passage several times, annotating it with notes. These notes become evidence for analysis and interpretation. On the course page, you will find the close reading guide with a list of questions to jumpstart your annotations. They will help you consider several different layers of the text one at a time. Not all the questions will prove relevant for every passage you analyze, so think of them as stones to overturn as you analyze more deeply. You won't necessarily discover something under every stone. The second step is to form an interpretation about the author's purpose or meaning in the passage. You do this by analyzing how, based on the details you've observed, the passage is designed to create a certain effect on the reader. The key to close reading is separating the two steps. It's important to take your time with the first step. Don't try to combine or explain your observations at that point. Just observe. Looking is key. It takes practice to adjust your eyes, so to speak, to details. This is partly the point of Scudder's story, Take This Fish and Look at It. Close reading is like looking at the fish. Another helpful image is Beth S. Neiman's metaphor of insect antennae. Neiman tells students to imagine they have sensitive insect-like antennae on their head that roam around the page, feeling for clues. The antennae are sensitive to unusual words, shifts in tone, anything that stands out. Maybe there are red lights at the end of the antenna that flash when they detect something. When they flash, you ask, I wonder why the author put that there. Use that construction, emphasize that point. How does this point fit into the work as a whole? What's the author's purpose? In future lessons, I will teach you some specific strategies for this first step, but for now, I just want you to analyze what you're seeing on your own, not relying on tools and instead trying to trust your observations. The second step, forming an interpretation, works well if you do this first step thoroughly. Now I will model the two steps of close reading in a brief example using a work of art as the text I'm close reading. The painting is Hoja Reading the Quran by Osman Hamdi Bey. First, I'll make a bunch of observations, and then I'll try to combine some of those observations into an interpretation. First, I'll just look at the painting and notice things. From the title, I infer the man seated in the center of the painting is Hoja, and the book he is holding is the Quran. I also infer we are looking at the interior of an Islamic mosque. There are two other figures in the background, one in the same reading posture as Hoja. The distance between Hoja and these other figures seems pretty significant, maybe 30 or 40 feet, suggesting this is a pretty large building. I'm going to look now for more specific and interesting details. For instance, something that stands out is the rug on which Hoja is seated. It's slightly wrinkled, right where you'd walk over it to enter the segmented area he's sitting in. It stands out because it's an imperfection in an otherwise orderly-looking space. I also see that the building is decorated simply but very elegantly. It's open and spacious, uncluttered by a lot of furniture. The large open part of the mosque between Hoja and the background figures is pretty much empty. And at the same time, all the surfaces are neatly decorated and in rich colors. I see the lamps hanging from the wired string above the doorway and walls. The area that Hoja is sitting in looks like it's focused on reading, so maybe the predominance of lamps is for lighting the room, which makes sense. The entire upper right quarter of the painting features artistic calligraphic panels. This calligraphy looks intricate and elongated. The colors, blue and gold, are calming. I also noticed that Hoja's clothes are rather blandly colored in comparison to the richly colorated decor. The clothes don't seem as sharply rendered, almost like they're out of focus, as if the painter forgot to finish painting them, or painted them in a different style. I'm not sure why the painter would do this. Zooming in a bit closer, I can make out Hoja's left index finger straight and pointing, presumably to a line on the page. His expression is quiet and intense. The left hand holds the book. Both hands are just as faded as his tunic, nearly the same color, almost blending together. Hoja's face, on the other hand, is quite distinct and has the same sharpness of detail as the rest of the painting. He's looking down. His expression is concentrated but unstrained. He's focused, content, attentive. Judging from the shape of his tunic, we can infer his posture is relaxed. He's probably sitting Indian style, maybe with his left leg beneath him and his right leg to the side. Either way, it would be uncomfortable for long periods unless he's well practiced at it. His facial expression and bodily posture together give the impression that he's pretty experienced and comfortable with this activity and maybe has been doing it a long time. He's mastered this. Now, as I pull back and look at how the scene is arranged, I notice that Hoja is right in the center. The angles are sharp. Perspectives are about 45 degrees, and with the wall and architecture all running parallel along this perspective, we get a sense of the depth of the space, but also of the proximity of Hoja. The space Hoja is in, even though it's separate from the others, seems a bit more intimate because it's tucked to the side and smaller in proportion on a human scale. There are books stacked untidily on the floor on the shelf behind him. And this detail adds to the feeling of an almost coziness in Hoja's reading nook. Now, normally I'd keep going like this, making observations, but let's stop there and move to the second step, forming an interpretation. Looking over my list of observations, I see that several of them point to the idea that the mosque is a formal, sacred space. It's simple, yet elegant, and it makes for a pleasing space, even though it has large dimensions and could almost feel a little distant or cold. We might say the building is designed to evoke a sense of the transcendent. We are small and God is big. This can help put us in the mood for contemplation and prayer. On the other hand, some of my observations focused on how comfortable and relaxed Hoja looks, how his reading is warm and intimate. The artist depicts his reading area as familiar, cozy, and humane. I'm thinking about the disheveled books and the rug, perhaps even the slight informality of Hoja's posture. You can relax there. These two patterns, on one hand, the warmth and intimacy we feel for Hoja, and on the other hand, the formality, which might come with a tone of coldness, seem like a contradiction, an odd juxtaposition. What does it mean? One possibility is that the combination of the larger, more formal space behind Hoja and the cozy, warm space he's sitting in creates the right conditions for spiritual reading or prayer. It is almost like Hoja has a private area for concentrated reading off to the side, but at the same time, he is part of something bigger, joined to others in a common activity. You can still see them in the distance. This depiction of Hoja creates an impression of a society that cares enough about its religious practices to create a beautiful and thoughtfully designed space to facilitate it. Hoja is part of that society, and he cares enough to develop the skills necessary to be a very good reader, someone who can use the space well. Notice how, through my analysis, I'm starting to see how the details of the painting work together to create an overall effect on the viewer. By thinking about how small observations go together, I've tried out some possible higher level observations. And at this point, I'm ready to try forming an interpretation. Given the observations I've made, what might Hamdi Bey's goal or purpose be in this painting? Based on my analysis, it seems likely that he wants to depict the reading of the Quran as a dignified or even beautiful activity, one worthy of our admiration and respect. If I were forming a thesis statement summarizing this interpretation, I might write something like this. In his painting, Hoja reading the Quran, Osman Hamdi Bey captures the beauty of the Islamic faith by showing the harmony between the reader and the interior design of the mosque. This is one possible interpretation of the painting, the one I came up with in this close reading. What matters is less the specific interpretation and more the process I followed. I went from small specific observations to an overall interpretation. At first, I didn't know the significance of all my observations, but eventually I formed larger observations and finally made a judgment about how those observations could be explained and connected to the artist's purpose. Also notice that I didn't use outside sources. I have a basic knowledge about Islamic culture, and this generally might have helped me a bit, but primarily I used the elements in the work itself to drive my interpretation. Close reading temporarily blocks out external sources and context and focuses directly on what is in the text or painting. When in a close reading mode, we set aside external sources and work with what is on the page or canvas. The goal is to strengthen our observations and interpretive skills, which are keys to good writing. We'll stop there. In future lessons, we'll add strategies and tools for close reading.